Well, hello and welcome to the Quadruple D. And today we're going to be talking about RFK Jr. and what's happening right now as I speak. And we're also going to be talking about Rush Limbaugh and his dumb brother. Well, they're both dumb, but we're going to be looking at the legacies of those two creans as well. So, RFK Jr. is in the news again. I don't really like talking about him because for some reason he's kind of boring. Despite being one of the quirkiest people on the planet, he still somehow manages to be really boring to talk about and to listen to. I don't know how that's possible to be that much of an interesting person in terms of when you see their lives on paper and when you hear some of the weird things they've done in their lives, yet you listen to them talk and they're just like, I don't know, it's like watching paint dry or something. But nevertheless, that's how it is. But amid mounting controversy over sweeping changes in public health oversight, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is facing the Senate Finance Committee today, September 4th, 2025. That's right now. It's happening as I'm recording this episode. He's going to be defending his actions and policies dubbed Make America Healthy Again. Senators are already grilling him sharply on a string of unsettling developments at the CDC. So, yeah, that's actually a pretty exciting thing happening today. And by exciting, I mean actually shockingly boring again. I'll get into more details of that in a little bit. But first, I want to remind you of a classic RFK Jr. moment. As noted in a headline, germ theory skeptic RFK Jr. goes swimming in sewage tainted water. That's right. That actually happened. And he even took some photos of it. So, you can see him in action swimming with his grandkids. And that's something that makes it a little bit less funny because he potentially endangered the health and safety of his own grandchildren. But, it has led me to joke about how difficult it would be if you're trying to hurt RFK Jr.'s feelings. So I wrote this on Facebook. I said, "Me, man, you seem like you have used a lot of drugs in your life." And RFK Jr. responds, "Yep." Me, "No, I mean, it seems like you must have had brain worms." RFK Jr., "Well, at least one. I missed that little scamp." Me, "No, I mean, I think you are an incompetent part of a fascist administration, and you forever ruined whatever positive legacy your family name may have carried. Why don't you just go swim in some sewage?" RFK Jr., eagerly running off, "Last one in's a rotten egg." Get it? Because he really did swim in some sewage. So it would be actually quite tricky to insult RFK Jr. because it's almost like everything you could come up with to insult him is something that he's actually done in his life. It's like there's nothing you could really say against him, other other than just what he's actually done in his life. So RFK Jr. also sounds like an old jalopy that spews out stupid bullshit. And I know some people out there they're gonna be like, "Don't make fun of his voice. He's got like a some sort of weird problem with his speech." But you know what? I'm not going to feel bad about that. I'm not going to apologize for it because he's a part of what is ruining this country. And, when it comes to those types of people, I'm not going to hold back that much because would anybody in the Trump administration hold back criticizing me about anything? No, no. They would not extend that same courtesy in my direction, so I'm not going to be so benevolent when it comes to them. So just a week earlier, before this little get together where they're grilling him on these questions and in these necessary forums, Kennedy forced out CDC Director Susan Monares, a seasoned microbiologist, confirmed less than a month prior, and it triggered the resignations of at least four top CDC officials. I think it might have been more than 4 by now. And they challenged his directives on vaccine policy. Their exit was framed by critics as a protest against anti science policies and political interference. But, the pro RFK people are probably just seeing it as a field day. They probably see it as a positive thing. Get those, those qualified people out of there and get the quacks in, because we need those quacks to keep the other quacks quacking, I guess. And Monares herself sharply condemned her dismissal in a Wall Street Journal op-ed published the same day that Kennedy testified. She wrote, "Once trusted experts are removed and advisory bodies are stacked, the results are predetermined. This isn't reform, it is sabotage." At the heart of the uproar in June 2025, Kennedy dismissed all 17 members of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or the ACIP, the CDC's key vaccine advisory body, and replaced them with hand picked allies whose views on childhood vaccines diverge sharply from scientific consensus. So, in an op ed of his own, Kennedy defended the overhaul as a needed purge of bureaucratic complacency. He asserted he was restoring trust in the CDC and eliminating conflicts, while he's eliminating people who might conflict with his views. That's really what's going on. And the outside analysts, including Bernie Sanders and journalistic editorial boards, see it differently. So Senator Bernie Sanders demanded Kennedy's resignation, accusing him of giving rise to anti vaccine misinformation and compromising public health. Well, it's not just misinformation, it's disinformation. The difference there is misinformation is more accidental, disinformation is more intentional and strategic. On the Republican side, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana, who as a physician played a pivotal role in Kennedy's confirmation, now finds himself in a delicate bind. Having initially trusted Kennedy's assurances during hearings that he would not hinder vaccination efforts, Cassidy now questions how those pledges align with recent developments. And of course, Cassidy is expected to possibly chicken out and not criticize RFK Jr. too sharply, and possibly not really get in the way of the MAGA agenda, or the Maha agenda as it's called, because he doesn't want to get on Trump's bad side because he's chickening out. Possibly, we'll see how that goes. I haven't been watching the hearing because I'm busy recording this right now. And meanwhile, Senator Tom Tillis, he seems no he seems like he's not going to be taking bull crap, because he's announced his retirement, so there's no real downside to his being outspoken. He may be more willing to confront Kennedy directly, particularly over what he sees as a rapid, incoherent dismissal of Monares. And what you have here is the centralization and power concentration that is pretty typical with authoritarianism. The quacks that Kennedy is setting up in these positions of power, they are going to cater to him and the anti-science messaging here. Kennedy's removal of independent experts and replacement with loyalists exemplifies how institutions can be hollowed out from within, transforming them from civic trust builders into organs of authoritarian consolidation. And you have ideological enforcement over evidence, that's being prioritized over evidence. So Monares' resistance to politically motivated vaccine policy was framed as insubordination. It really shows you how expertise can be at least close to criminalized when it stands in opposition to power. So I know she was technically fired and not criminalized, but we'll see. We'll see how far this gets. Will there be prosecutions of people who just believe in vaccine science? And some of these people out there, they have talked about punishing Dr. Fauci and stuff like that. So this could get extremely dark. We'll see how far they take it. And you've got state violence through public health rhetoric, the mass resignations and career terminating pressure on professionals. They're a cautionary tale about how the state can ostracize dissenting experts and replace merit with ideological conformity. And the resulting health crises, the increased aspects of people getting these diseases that were once not common. Well, that in itself is sort of like state violence. It's a de facto state violence because these are preventable deaths that would not be happening if we had more competent people, people who actually believed in science in these key positions. Now, obviously, things haven't quite escalated to the point that they could hypothetically reach, where you've got like I don't know how many, untold millions dying or something like that. At least I don't think we've reached that point yet. But there have already been some preventable deaths that have occurred because of vaccine skepticism. So there's already blood on these people's hands. And there's erosion of democratic accountability. Cassidy's predicament, caught between political loyalty and medical ethics, reflects how state actors become complicit in anti scientific policy when ideological loyalty trumps accountability. And Kennedy's reorganization of the CDC and the ACIP bypassed broader institutional checks. And I mean, the position of Kennedy is it's supposed to be that he can't just fire people. From what I understand, that was supposed to be Trump who could fire somebody, and that's kind of freaky altogether anyway, because Donald Trump might fire somebody just based on a whim, just based on whether they appear to be loyal to him or whatever. So basically, you've got quacks all around in this situation. All right, I'm going to move on a little bit to the second segment, which is about Rush Limbaugh. He is the peripheral poophead of the week. And this is partly because Rush Limbaugh was actually kind of a critic of RFK Jr. back when RFK Jr. was actually more of a, well, he was more of an environmental activist and lawyer. So Rush said, "Where are RFK Jr.'s credentials? His number one credential is his last name, and number two, he's got an approved cause, world peace, save the world with environmentalism or what have you. He doesn't need qualifications. All he needs is a fax machine and a logo and a phone number to ABC, CBS, NBC, and they will anoint him with expert status." So oddly enough, like Rush Limbaugh, I don't think he was entirely wrong with that premise. I mean, it's probably an oversimplification to a degree, but it's not totally 100% inaccurate. You know, Bourgeois legitimacy often hinges less on grassroots organizing or horizontal movements, and it has more to do with branding, media access, and inherited privilege. And that seems to actually at least significantly describe RFK Jr.'s authority. It's more about his links to elite channels, so to speak. His family lineage. And, there's also what Rush Limbaugh said on RFK Jr.'s entry into environmental advocacy. So Rush said that RFK Jr. got into the environmentalism business because he was sentenced to it. In 1984, Kennedy joined the Riverkeeper organization to satisfy the 1,500 hours community service to which he was sentenced. And then after his 1,500 hours of community service was complete, the group hired Kennedy as its chief attorney. So that's what Rush Limbaugh theorized. And the factual record tells a somewhat different story, but it's actually not entirely different. I have to say, Rush Limbaugh was not totally lying. He was just perhaps oversimplifying a little bit. So in September 1983, RFK Jr. was arrested for felony heroin possession. In February 1984, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to probation, mandatory Narcotics Anonymous, exams, and community service, and that was between 800 and 1,500 hours, that community service sentence. So to fulfill this sentence, he started volunteering in 1984 at the Hudson River Fishermen's Association, which later was called Riverkeeper. And once he passed the New York bar in 1985, Riverkeeper brought him on as senior or chief attorney. So oddly enough, Rush Hudson Limbaugh III was not entirely incorrect. So, I've got to give some credit where it's due. I thought maybe that was going to be more of a bullcrap line, but there is actually some accuracy to it. So who is Rush Hudson Limbaugh III? Well, he was born in Missouri into a well-established legal and political family. So once again, you might think Rush Limbaugh was actually an outsider, which is something people say all the time about Trump. But just like Trump, no, Rush Limbaugh was not a political outsider. He was in a political family. His grandfather, Rush Limbaugh Sr., was a longtime Missouri prosecutor, state legislator, judge, and even served as U.S. ambassador to India, retiring at age 102 after a storied legal career. So that alone gives you an idea of how Rush Limbaugh may have become involved in politics. And his father, a World War II fighter pilot and attorney, and he also had other relatives who held judicial and political posts. And even as a teenager, Limbaugh defied expectations. He began broadcast work at age 16 under the air name Rusty Sharp, and he dropped out of Southeast Missouri State University after 2 semesters and pursued radio full time. So he found his calling at a young age. His early 70s career in radio was rocky. Fired from stations in Pittsburgh and Kansas City, he pivoted to promotions for the Kansas City Royals before returning to radio in 1983 through 1984. And obviously, he had a career beyond then, but or beyond that. And in Sacramento, he replaced Morton Downey Jr. on KFBK. And Morton Downey Jr. was controversial in his own way, and he probably had a role in inspiring Rush Limbaugh. And Rush developed his provocative style that launched his national trajectory during this time. The Rush Limbaugh Show began national syndication on August 1st, 1988, after the Reagan era repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, which freed editorial voices like his from equal time obligations. So he no longer had to legally preside over broadcasts where you had various views that were presented. He could just say what he wanted and leave it at that. And his 3 hour format, very opinion driven, guest free, and caller light was novel for his style of broadcasting. By the 1990s, it reached tens of millions weekly and dominated American talk radio to the point where I have to say that even my mom sometimes would listen to Rush Limbaugh, which I remember when I was younger. And I didn't like the guy even back then. So in the mid 1990s, Limbaugh even hosted a national TV show which ran from 1992 to 1996 and briefly worked as an NFL commentator for ESPN. He won various awards like the Radio Hall of Fame and the National Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. I believe that's what NAB stands for. And of course, he wrote 7 books, with his first two becoming New York Times bestsellers. That was The Way Things Ought to Be, See, I Told You So. Now, snarky titles, I guess you might say, especially See, I Told You So. At his peak, estimates record his 2018 income at 84.5 million and his show's weekly audience at around 15.5 million. He was the most listened to radio program in the US, which, ugh, it could make a person gag. And Limbaugh's voice often trafficked in inflammatory rhetoric on race, LGBT people, feminism, sexual consent. I almost said sexual content, but no, sexual consent, climate change, birther conspiracies, involving Barack Obama, all that type of garbage. So the dude normalized these right wing idiotic talking points. I'm sure immigration was another one that he was probably a constant immigrant basher. All these people, they go after these vulnerable targets. The low hanging fruit, I guess you might say. He normalized the term feminazis as if there are no anti-feminist types who are like Nazis. Only the feminist types can be like Nazis. Not literal Nazis are Nazis. It's a standard type of thing where you have to sort of flip reality. So like the people who tend to criticize power, they're the ones who are actually the scary ones, not the people in power. So like the right wingers, they will try to debunk ideas like the patriarchy and stuff like that. And ironically, they are the ones who are quickest to represent ideas like the patriarchy. So there's this really weird thing. It's like these Holocaust deniers who are actually the quickest to make it seem like they want a Holocaust. Like it's a weird thing. Like these Nazi types will deny that the Holocaust happened, yet they're the same ones who make it seem like they want one to happen. It's a strange dynamic, but it's a way of like clouding the issue and shifting the harsh reality around, like flipping things on its head. Like instead of threats to women's rights being a problem, the uh, the enemy is supposed to be, feminists who might take things a little bit too far and be a little bit too anti man and anti male in their narratives or whatever. And I have to agree that there are some feminists who very much match that stereotype and who might give people on the left a bad name. But guess what? They're not scarier than the people out there who are wanting to take away women's rights, including, of course, like abortion rights, but also even things like the women's rights to vote and stuff like that. So that's one of the weird things about these people. They sort of invert what the biggest threat is. You know what I'm saying? And anyway, Russia's attack on pro contraceptive advocate Sandra Fluke involved him calling her a slut and prostitute, which actually sparked massive backlash and advertiser pullouts from his crappy show. In 2020, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Trump during the State of the Union address. A few weeks later, he publicly revealed his advanced lung cancer diagnosis, and he passed away on February 17th, 2021, in Palm Beach, Florida. So, his legacy is polarizing, as you might imagine, just as his broadcasting career was polarizing. On one hand, he's regarded as the inventor of modern conservative talk radio, empowering the GOP and reshaping media norms. 2022 academic study even found higher local exposure to his show correlated with increased support for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020 elections, and more hardened partisan views. So, yikes. And on the other hand, critics like myself argue that Limbaugh's influence accelerated cultural fragmentation, normalized disinformation, and contributed to a climate in which truth became negotiable. It started to matter more about what a person's individual truth was, not what the actual facts were, the things that were, true beyond dispute, pretty much. And his role in fostering division and fueling conspiracy-minded audiences, it continues to be scrutinized, and justifiably so. He played a major role in creating this crappy situation we are in today. So Rush Limbaugh's career served as a textbook case of how centralized media power, in this case amplified by deregulation like the demise of the fairness doctrine, it can steer public opinion, erode civic discourse, and entrench conservative power structures and their talking points. That's one of the reasons they can control the narrative, is because they already have a lot of control over the power structures. So that's why it's so hard to, chip away at their messaging. And you also have people who just refuse to even make much of an effort to do so. And his platform exemplifies how mass communication becomes a tool of ideological enforcement rather than a community dialogue, especially when dissenting or marginalized voices lack equal access or representation. His style cultivated a fan identity. They call themselves ditto heads and reinforced top down political narratives, often at odds with, you know, just reality. And if we value autonomy, solidarity, and the truth, Limbaugh's model shows why democratizing speech, ever wary of concentrated media influence, is vital to resist the spiral of polarization. So we need to have more democratic access to, these just media in general, and that includes social media. And that's why they sometimes call it a war of information, because that kind of is what it is. All right, moving on to the third segment of the show, the fetid fever dream flashback of the week. And I'll be talking about David Limbaugh, Rush's younger brother, and his biggest scandal, the anti-gay smears and falsehoods. Arguably the most damaging controversy tied to David Limbaugh centers on a 2008 syndicated column in which he launched a barrage of homophobic attacks at Kevin Jennings, then an official in the U.S. Department of Education. Limbaugh labeled Jennings a known homosexual activist, which is supposed to be like a crime in the conservative community, if you want to call it that. And he accused Jennings of propagandizing for the normalization of homosexuality and propagated several false claims, including that Jennings failed to report statutory assault, praised assaulting the young, or endorsed sexual content like fisting workshops. All of these allegations have been conclusively debunked by reliable sources and fact checkers. Like the fisting workshop thing, that was something that actually did happen, but all of those people were fired or they resigned. And Jennings actually came out and criticized that workshop. It was something that a lot of people thought should not have happened. And I'll get into why this is hypocritical actually a little bit in a little bit here. But basically, he tried to tie Jennings to that, even though he had nothing really to do with it. And conservatives they fear openness and honesty about sexuality. I'll just put it that way. They think that if you hear about something, you're automatically going to go out and do it. So if I hear about the existence of like gay people or whatever, I'm just instantly going to go out and do it, which is funny because my father was an alcoholic. How come I never touched any alcohol? I had exposure to beer. Well, I guess I have technically drank a glass, like part of a glass of wine before, and I've tasted beer, but I'm not an alcoholic. How come I'm not one of those when I was exposed to that as a kid? You know? So it's a flimsy premise right out the gate. It's just like they're fear mongering about, supposed pornographic books in libraries. Well, let's just be honest here. If there was actually pornographic material in libraries, kids would be in there reading that all the time. You know what I mean? Like let's be real here. There is not. I know I would have if they had Playboys in the library when I was in high school and stuff like that. Penthouse, I would have been in there. These are to a large degree lies, and they're fabrications or exaggerations. They might have a little bit of sexual content in a book, like a classic story that does have a sex scene, and they'll fearmonger about it. And I'm going to get into how the Bible itself is actually in many ways pornographic. So hold on for that little part of this segment. But anyway, Media Matters for America catalogs how Limbaugh, this is David Limbaugh, marshaled these distortions. He employed them as leverage in a broader conservative crusade against LGBTQ plus representation that sustained campaigns of misrepresentation grounded in homophobia and demonstrably false assertions. And it was his clearest and most harmful public scandal. And all right, so what was I talking about with the sexual and sometimes outright disturbing Bible narratives? Well, are you ready? In Ezekiel 23:20, it contains the package or the passage. I said package. Freudian slip, I guess. But the passage, she lusted after her lovers, whose genitals were like those of donkeys, and whose semen was like that of horses. So that's in the Bible, folks, talking about horse ejaculations and comparing it to comparing male genitalia to that of donkeys. So why would you let that smut be taught in schools when it's obviously pornographic? And what about Genesis 38? Tamar, a widow, disguised herself as a prostitute to trick her father in law, Judah, into having sex with her. She did this to produce an heir in a desperate act to ensure her family line was propagated. So, well, that's in the Bible. Genesis 38. There's also the Levite's concubine in Judges 19 that I just looked into. It's a shocking and violent story in which a Levite man gives his concubine over to a mob in Gibeah, that's spelled like Gibeah, and she is sexually abused. I'll just put it that way. And her brutalized body is later dismembered, leading to a war among the tribes of Israel. So very disturbing scene involving sexual violence. Why would you let that be taught in your schools? Incestuous relationships are also in the Bible. Well, as I kind of hinted at earlier, but the Bible narrates stories of incestuous relationships, including Lot and his daughters in Genesis 19, and Amnon and his half sister Tamar in Samuel 13. And even though it speaks against a lot of these unions in Leviticus, nevertheless, they're presented in the Bible. They go into detail about these things. And of course, Leviticus also famously bans people from eating things like shrimp. So if you eat shrimp, are you going to go to hell? You got to ask that question just as well as you might ask about if you have sexual relations with a man and you are a man, or if you have any sort of homosexual relationship. People will say, "Oh, Leviticus, the Bible condemns that," but the Bible condemns practically anything, including sexual thought in general. You can go to hell for practically anything, just having the wrong thoughts, let alone what sort of actions you have. Basically, anything that could be construed as dirty could be kept out of school libraries, including just basic information about the birds and the bees. And sure enough, in high school, I had one of my classmates who had his parents opt him out of getting sex ed, and he seemed embarrassed by it. He seemed like, not that he necessarily wanted to be in sex ed, but he seemed a little bit embarrassed by the fact that he was excluded from it. And it's one of those things where you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, because sex ed is a little bit embarrassing if you're taking it, if you're in one of those sessions. But it's, well, I made it sound like it is a sexual session. I don't mean it in that way. I just mean education. Um, but anyway, it's also embarrassing if you're barred from participating in that class by your parents or whatever legal guardians you have. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't, really. And for another passage, there is Genesis 38, and that involves somebody named Onan, who was struck down by God for spilling his semen on the ground instead of impregnating his deceased brother's wife. So I gotta admit, I'm not really familiar with the context of that, but it sounds a little bit twisted. You know what I mean? It's a little bit odd. If I had kids, I wouldn't want my kids reading that filth. And you know, let's also consider this David Limbaugh episode through the lens of power, authority, and hierarchy, which I often do on these episodes here. So it's discrediting nonconformity as a control mechanism. Limbaugh's attacks weren't just personal, they marked a broader pattern using fears about homosexuality to enforce social conformity and hierarchical power norms. It's a classic tool of the state and institutionalized religion and zealots to marginalize, isolate, and threaten those who challenge rigid moral authority. And it's also fear tactics to maintain systemic dominance. So, casting this Jennings guy, and by extension LGBTQ plus individuals overall, as morally or socially dangerous, it serves a deeper function. It stokes collective anxiety, which reinforces support for dominant systems, be they religious, political, or institutional, in some other way, like a domineering father who is, a bigot against LGBTQ people, or it could also be some against another group like immigrants or basically anything like that. The use of fear tactics, it's there to promise order and moral safety because these people are spooky and dangerous, and it's a way oppressive institutions perpetuate themselves through moral panics and the idea that if if we don't keep these groups at bay, the entirety of society is going to fall. And like if you think about the normalization of people who smoke pot, for example, for many, many years they were arguing, oh no, society is going to fall apart if, marijuana is increasingly legalized. But guess what? In the state of Michigan, where I happen to live, society has not totally fallen apart. And people do smoke the Mary Jane. So a lot of these fear-based campaigns, they've already been thoroughly debunked over the years, and it's something that people really need to remember more often, like the paranoia about marijuana usage, but also in some ways the paranoia about hard drugs too, because I'm not an advocate for like cocaine or heroin, but it's kind of not the end of the world if somebody does use those drugs. And guess what? RFK Jr. was a heroin addict. So, the idea that you can't ever have a prominent position in life, you can't have success if you've done drugs or anything like that. It's a fear-based thing. So many people have done drugs, so many people have been alcoholics, and they've done this or they've done that. They've sometimes just done wrong things. But sometimes there is a redemption arc, and the idea that if you're just born a certain way that you're instantly a villain to be distrusted or something. You really have to kind of treat that the same way that you would a recovering drug addict or something. Not to say they need to recover. That's not what I'm trying to say. But we all have things that set us apart. We all have things that some people fear about us, and then maybe they get to know us and they realize, oh, this type of person isn't. They're not all that bad. There are actually good qualities of them. So my initial fear or distrust about them, maybe it was misguided. Maybe it was actually grounded in disinformation, and maybe even this person who I feared is actually superior to the people who are lying about them. That sometimes happens too. Well, a lot of the time that will actually happen. Well, anyway, you've also got in this David Limbaugh thing the idea that we got to prioritize state power, surveillance, and moral policing. So that's another part of this. Even though they will call themselves small government conservatives, they're actually in favor of not just big government, but huge government. David Limbaugh's smear campaign aided efforts to monitor and regulate educational content, teaching, and discourse to a greater degree than necessary. I'll just put it that way. So, by framing LGBTQ plus advocacy as subversive or criminal, it paves the way for policing moral behavior in schools and beyond. Ironically, genuine small government conservatives would question or outright oppose the state's enforcement of these moral boundaries, seeing it as a form of authoritarian control over individual autonomy. So, my own personal opinion is that if it's between consenting adults, what's there to even debate that much about it? You know, let people live their own lives. I don't see what the issue is that much. I mean, obviously, people can try to pry into others' lives as much as they want, but at a certain point, you're inviting scrutiny into your own life as well if you're doing that. So keep that in mind. And you also have the erosion of trust in institutions, which was another aim of this. Spreading false claims undermines public trust, not just in people like Jennings, but in public institutions broadly, such as the school system. And these campaigns contribute to cynicism, eroding communal ties, and dissolving faith in collective self governance. You need government mouthpieces of God. That you need these representatives of God on earth to tell you uh, what can be taught in schools. They can protect us from filth and reality, when in reality, the life itself is actually a filthy thing. That's just how it is. We all sit on the toilet and uh, excrete waste, for example. If you were to describe that in detail, it would sound filthy enough. But it's something people do every day, at least at least in reality. So anyway, David Limbaugh's repeated homophobic smears targeting Kevin Jennings, which were based on debunked claims, were his most serious controversy. And there was that moral panic element, weaponized by authority figures to suppress dissent, enforce social norms, justify surveillance, and undermine trust, all of which actual small